Hi guys, Amy here. I just wanted to give you some feedback to wrap up our plagiarism discussion from last week. You guys came up with some really good stuff, as I mentioned in my midweek comments and updates. So I'm not going to address too much of your thoughts from the original posts, but I just want to kind of bring in some of the reflections that you guys did at the end of the week to wrap everything up and kind of synthesize all the points that I wanted you to take away from this activity. So we'll start. I just pulled out some really good thoughts that I thought you guys brought up in your comments first. Um, One of the things that I noticed this week that was maybe a little bit different than previous weeks is that you guys were doing a really good job kind of questioning and also redirecting each other. So I noticed a couple of places where maybe there were some misconceptions or some incorrect assumptions or misunderstandings in the original posts, and then you guys were very proactive about getting in there in your comments, questioning each other and also even challenging each other at times if the information provided in the original wasn't entirely accurate. So I really appreciated that because that's kind of a moment for you to learn from each other, and that's really the benefit of collaboration in the classroom. And so I appreciated your all's willingness to provide that kind of feedback to one another, but then also be receptive to receiving that kind of feedback from your peers. So a couple examples here. This person said, I really like the way you set up this discussion. Would you suggest to the writer to use author tags, or would quoting it be easier? This is a good example of questioning the original author as you post your comments throughout the week. However, I did want to correct something that's almost implied here, which is that these two things are mutually exclusive. In fact, you would want to use author tags even when you're quoting it, so it's not kind of an either or thing, when in fact you do need to use an author tag or at least a parenthetical citation anytime you're providing information from your sources, regardless of whether it's in the form of quote or in the form of paraphrase. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. Okay, so then also this second one here is another good example of a comment that really pushed the discussion in another direction and brought out some extension of the concepts that we were discussing. So this person says, my question is, how does one know whether something is common knowledge and therefore does not have to be quoted? I wanted to pull this out because I think this is a really common question that students have frequently when they say, well, I just know this information. I shouldn't have to cite it. It's in my head. And so I want to point out that there are really three different kinds of quote unquote information that you need to distinguish between as you are working sources into your own writing. The first is the thoughts or the kind of thoughts that originate entirely in your own brain. So the things that are completely original to you. The second kind of information is information that you know maybe you heard somewhere. It didn't completely originate in your head, but you don't really know where you heard it, and it's always been something that you've kind of understood. And I think that's what this person is referring to here as common knowledge. And then the third type of information is information that you obviously got from a source and you know where you got that information. So these three things are very different in the sense that some of it needs to be cited and some of it does not. And it's pretty obvious that information or ideas that completely originate in your own brain do not need to be cited. And any information that completely does come from a source or you know where you found it does need to be cited. So those are the obvious ones. But the gray area is with, again, what this person is referring to as common knowledge, the kind of information that we know, and we know we got it somewhere, but we're not sure where, and we're not sure maybe even when, and it feels like something that we just kind of intrinsically know. And so there's a really ambiguous line there as to what would qualify as ideas that originate in your own head versus something you heard somewhere that came from some potential source, but you don't know what it is. So there is a general rule that you can follow for determining what is common knowledge, but a lot of students find it unsatisfactory because it still requires you to go find sources. So I think that also speaks to something that's implied here, which is that the question about common knowledge oftentimes comes from a place of maybe frustration with the research process or with documentation and citing sources, because common knowledge is really just a way to get around citing a source. I mean, unless it originated in your own head, all information came from somewhere. So technically, you should be able to track it down and cite it. But again, the general rule is that if you can find some information in 3 reputable sources where it is not cited, then it qualifies as common knowledge. Because if there are at least 3 good sources out there that are treating it like common knowledge, then you can reasonably assume that it is common knowledge. And so if other people aren't citing it, then you don't have to cite it. But if other people are, then you should. And like I said, I mean, technically there is a source for everything that doesn't completely originate in your own head. So you should be able to find it somewhere and cite it. And so common knowledge to me is really just a shortcut. So I would encourage you to kind of err on those extremes more than in the middle. So try to really stick to in your arguments developing your own original thinking by pulling in information that you absolutely know comes from a source and you know where you got it so that you can cite it. Okay. And along with that, as I mentioned, I was going to say a little bit more about author tags and parentheticals. Author tags and parenthetical citations work hand in hand. It is preferred to put the author's last name in the sentence using an author tag or an attributive tag, according to MLA style. The reason for that is because it allows you to place the author's name a little bit more closely to the information within the actual sentence and not put that author's name all the way at the end of the sentence. However, there are times when it might be beneficial to use a parenthetical instead. So I'll show you what I'm talking about here just by looking at the example that was in the prompt for this week. So here in the acceptable paraphrase, we have an attributive tag. According to McGrath, women in Bodai rarely suffered at the hands of criminals. I'm sorry, this is a typo. Let me fix this real quick. I'm sorry, you guys must have been so confused. All right, let me update that. All right, so according to McGrath, women in Bodai rarely suffered at the hands of criminals. And then we have the page number here in parentheses. If there were not reliable page numbers for this source, you would not even include the parenthetical. You would just put the period right there after criminals. However, if you have a PDF electronic file or actual hard copy print text source, physical source, then you do need to include the page number in the parenthetical at the end of the sentence before the terminal period. However, it is also acceptable to paraphrase this and move the author's last name into the parentheses. Now, as I said, the preferred method in MLA is to use the attributive tag within the sentence, because then you can place it right next to that information and it's not going to be all the way at the end of the sentence. But if you are trying to maybe give your own voice a little bit more emphasis, it would not be wrong to take this name, move it into the parentheses, as I said, get rid of the rest of the attributive tag, capitalize the sentence, and just make this your paraphrase. Women in Bodai rarely suffered at the hands of criminals. McGrath 612. This is correct documentation. So think about, when would it maybe be preferable for you to reserve that source name or that attributive tag into the parentheses rather than putting it within the sentence itself? If you are trying to really maintain authority and allow your voice to dominate the discussion, putting the attribution within the parentheses here downplays it a little bit more, and it makes it almost like fine print, and the reader is more apt to kind of skip over it, and it's less intrusive to the writing itself, even though it is still completely appropriately documented. And so I think in some cases you can get the best of both worlds by putting the author's last name in the parentheses, because you're still citing it correctly, but you get to maintain the voice a little bit more. On the other hand, when you have the author's last name within the sentence, as I've mentioned before, it's a little more precise as to the information that came from this person, and you can also build your credibility this way by giving the reader maybe some information about the writer's credentials or the source's authority that way. So like, according to historian Edward McGrath, or what if I said something like Harvard University history professor Edward McGrath, then that would allow me to give just a little bit more of the credentials of this source and kind of build up my authority, as I said before. Okay, going back to the things you said to each other in comments, these last two kind of, again, synthesize what are the takeaways that I wanted you guys to learn this week. Using only different wording would not be enough to be considered plagiarism, and what I think this person means here is not plagiarism. You need to change the structure of the sentence as well as put in your own ideas using the authors as supporting details. The whole idea behind paraphrasing is demonstrating you understand what the author is trying to say. Simply quoting an author does not give you this feeling that you know what they are trying to say. I also have to say that I think the plagiarized sentence was not word for word, but more structurally identical. There were some words left out or changed slightly, therefore making quotes obsolete. So a couple of good ideas here. One in the first half, well, really three. One is that you do want to just use your sources to support your own independent thinking. So you have your own argument, you have your own opinions and claims that you're developing, and then you just bring in the quote and paraphrase from that author as a supporting detail. The second good idea that's brought up here is that paraphrase does demonstrate more accurately that you understood what that writer was saying, because as I've said in previous discussions, it's like you can put it into your brain, mix it up, and spit it back out in your own words. And quoting doesn't really convey that same level of understanding. However, as always, there are still times when it might be more appropriate to quote, as we've seen in this discussion and previous discussions, like when you're trying to give your source a little bit more authority, or just show the reader that you haven't distorted it in any way, or if there's like a really compelling statistic or something that that source has said in a particularly effective or memorable way. And then the third thing that's here is that, in fact, the example that was unacceptable paraphrase would not be okay just to put quotes around it. And that's something I mentioned in my midweek update. Because there are some words changed, even though it's just a couple of words in some cases, you still can't put quotes around it, because if you quote it, it has to be exactly word for word what it said in the original. And so if you are going to paraphrase, you need to change it entirely, or if you quote, you need to keep it exactly the same. And that was something that I think somebody said in this discussion as well, is like, you need to pick one or the other. You can't kind of do both. Okay, and this last one again, kind of just sums it up. It can be hard sometimes to come up with your own wording and still get the main points across, especially with more complicated text. This example shows what a more obvious situation of plagiarism. However, sometimes it can be a lot easier to miss, especially to the writer. So this was, yeah, a really good point, because I know I'm giving you very obvious examples to talk about, and in real life, usually it's not the obvious examples that trip us up. It's like the more subtle examples that are easy to miss, especially to the writer. But I think this speaks to the importance of peer review. As writers, it is so easy to skip over things, mistakes, errors. It's so easy to think we're explaining things clearly when really we're not. And until you get that audience perspective, you're really never going to be able to look at your writing completely objectively. And so getting that feedback is invaluable as you're working to give the reader what they need. I mean, you're trying to convey this to the reader, so it's important to know what they are hearing from you. And so that's what peer review can do before you finalize something or before you get to that final draft. You know, let somebody that you trust look at your essay and say, does this seem like plagiarism, or can you tell that I put this in my own words? Okay, so those were some good comments. I also pulled out other good comments earlier in my midweek updates, and so certainly this doesn't encompass everything good that you suggested to each other. So thanks for your hard work there. And then in your reflections, as I said before, you did a great job synthesizing those main learning objectives for that activity, for this activity. This one here says, to help in avoiding plagiarism, it would be wise to come up with a strong thesis statement or argument that is original to your own thoughts and research. I believe that by doing that, you can avoid plagiarism a lot easier and only use your sources to back up what you're trying to say. Yes, this is perfect. I totally agree that you're always going to have an easier time avoiding plagiarism awesome when you have your own argument that's solid, your own ideas that you're using your sources to back up, and that's the focus.